In 1983, Nigerians celebrated when the military overthrew their own democracy, not because they loved military rule, but because the government they had elected was drowning in corruption. At the center of that government was a quiet school teacher from Sokoto, President Shehu Shagari. On October 1, 1979, a date heavy with symbolism, Nigeria's 19th independence anniversary, Shehu Shagari was inaugurated as the first executive president of Nigeria's second republic. The military had handed over after 13 years. Nigerians were cautiously hopeful. Oil money flowed. There was, for a brief season, the fragile possibility of something better. He was born on February 25, 1925, in Shagari village, Sokoto State. A name his parents could not have known would define the arc of Nigerian history. He trained as a teacher, then entered politics during the First Republic, serving under the Northern People's Congress, NPC, and as a minister under Tafawa Balewa. Through the military years, he held various federal appointments. He was known as a quiet man, a consensus builder, a man whose word was his bond. His election in 1979 under the National Party of Nigeria, NPN, was controversial from the start. The Constitution required a winner to secure not just a plurality of votes, but at least 25% of the vote in at least two-thirds, 24 of 36 of the states. Shagari won 5.7 million votes to Obafemi Awolowo's 4.9 million, but his 25% distribution was disputed. He reached 25% in only 12 states and met a partial threshold in a 13th. The Federal Electoral Commission, FEDECO, and the courts declared him the winner on a mathematical interpretation that many found unconvincing. He took office under a cloud that never quite lifted. The early Shagari years coincided with the tail end of Nigeria's oil boom. Petrodollars flooded government coffers. His administration commissioned ambitious projects, roads, hospitals, universities. The Green Revolution agricultural program aimed to make Nigeria self-sufficient in food. The low-cost housing program set out to give ordinary Nigerians homes they could afford. But even in these flush years, something was going wrong beneath the surface. The federal structure Shagari presided over was riddled with ghost workers, civil servants who existed only on payrolls. Governors imported luxury cars. Contractors collected payments for roads never built. The bureaucracy ballooned with political appointees who owed loyalty not to Nigeria, but to the men who gave them their positions. "You cannot eat your cake and have it," a proverb Shagari used often. The thieves around him took that as a challenge. Shagari's fundamental failure was not personal corruption. Historians are largely in agreement that he did not steal. His failure was different, perhaps more consequential. He could not or would not stop those around him. His party, the NPN, was a coalition of godfathers, powerful regional bosses who had delivered votes and now expected their reward. Men like Umaru Diko, who served as his transport minister, became symbols of a new and brazen Nigerian corruption. Diko controlled the presidential task force on rice importation, and the opportunities for personal enrichment were staggering. By 1983, Nigeria was importing rice on a scale that enriched a small class of connected businessmen, while domestic farmers found no market for their harvest. The Shagari administration presided over what became known as the settlement system, a polite Nigerian term for institutionalized bribery, in which every transaction with government required a percentage for someone. Contracts were inflated routinely. Oil revenues were not fully accounted for. The Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, became a black hole into which billions of naira disappeared. In 1981, global oil prices collapsed.
Nigeria, which had come to depend on oil for nearly 90% of its foreign exchange earnings, was suddenly terribly exposed. Shagari's administration turned to austerity measures, but the message of sacrifice rang hollow when it came from a government whose members were visibly wealthy. By 1982, Nigeria could not pay its foreign debts. External reserves were nearly exhausted. The naira fell. Imports dried up. There were shortages of everything: foreign exchange, drugs, spare parts, flour. The government introduced an Economic Stabilization Act that imposed import restrictions, but implementation was chaotic, and the black market for foreign currency swelled. Shagari himself seemed haunted by the distance between what he had hoped to achieve and what was happening. He gave speeches about discipline and sacrifice. His ministers continued to live ostentatiously. Nigeria watched the contradiction with growing fury. The elections of August and September 1983 were, even by Nigerian standards, spectacular in their brazenness. Governors were returned to office with implausible majorities. Ballot boxes were stuffed in broad daylight. In Ondo State, opposition Unity Party of Nigeria supporters were met with violence. In Oyo State, results were simply announced with no counting. Shagari himself was re-elected in an outcome that few believed. The man who had won a disputed election in 1979 now won one in 1983, whose dishonesty was on open display. Whether he personally ordered the rigging or whether his party machinery operated beyond his control is a question historians continue to debate. What is not debated is the result: a democracy so degraded that nobody, including its beneficiaries, could defend it with a straight face. In the early hours of December 31, 1983, Nigerians awoke to the sound of military music on the radio, the unmistakable sound of a coup. Major General Muhammad Buhari had taken power. Shagari was arrested at the State House in Dodan Barracks and taken into detention. He would remain under restriction for years, charged with no crime, tried in no court. The military's Supreme Military Council dissolved all elected governments and suspended the constitution. The Nigerian public's reaction was, and this is the part that should break every Democrat's heart, largely relief. People came out into the streets. They celebrated. Buhari was received as a savior. The Second Republic had been so thoroughly plundered, so visibly rotten, that its death was greeted as a mercy killing. Shagari was eventually released without charge. He spent his later years in quiet retirement in Sokoto, largely out of public life. He gave occasional interviews in which he expressed regret, measured, dignified, restrained. He died on December 28, 2018, at the age of 93, leaving behind a legacy defined by one defining question: can a decent man run an indecent system and remain decent? I never personally enriched myself, but I know that things happened around me that should not have happened. I bear my share of that responsibility. Shehu Shagari, in his later years.
The Second Republic ended not with applause, but with soldiers at the gates of power. In the next episode, we will tell the story of the man who replaced Shehu Shagari, the austere general who promised discipline, war against corruption, and a new Nigeria. But his rule would bring its own controversies, its own fears, and its own legacy. If you want to understand how Nigeria moved from democracy back into military rule, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story of Nigeria's coups is far from over.